Started now. I'm Mike Tremoglie. I'm moderator for this evening, and I have a fairly simple task, but which kind of reminds me of the joke of the actor who only had to learn one line. I think it's a mouse. And he repeated the line, and he repeated the line, and he repeated the line, and the night of the play, he's out on stage, his scene's coming up, and he sees this thing going across the stage. He goes, "What the hell was that?" So the moral of the story is you can screw up a simple task, and I hope I won't do that tonight. We've got two very, very dynamic speakers, both experts in the topic of prison reform. One is, and I will introduce them to you later, but first I want to mention that the co-sponsors for this evening are the Federal Society of Philadelphia and the UPenn Statesman. And I'm going to introduce Chris Tremoglie, no relation, yeah, he is related. And he will introduce you to the UPenn Statesman, and that'll be followed by Matt Hank, who's the chapter president of the Federal Society. So, Chris.
Hi, everybody. I have an even simpler task. So I am a senior editor for the UPenn Statesman. It is the truly independent newspaper here at University of Pennsylvania, offering students a perspective of news that is not traditionally given. In attendance is the new editor-in-chief of the Statesman, Cindy Gwynn, so a round of applause for her. So I appreciate everyone coming out tonight and looking forward to a spirited and interesting symposium. And with that, I believe Mr. Hank.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. I'll be brief. As you know, I'm the president of the Philadelphia chapter of the Federal Society. I want to thank you for coming tonight. Those of you who are members, thank you. Those of you who aren't members, when you fill out your CLE form, if you're interested in joining us, please mark it on the form, and I will send you the link to join us, and I'll send you our last update. You may want to know who we are before you make that decision. It's pretty simple. We believe in three things. We believe that the state exists to preserve individual freedom, that separation of powers is essential to that goal, and that it's the province of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. If those principles have appeal to you, then we are the organization for you. Please join us. Thanks again for coming out, and I now turn you over to our distinguished panel.
Chris, Matt, thanks very much. As I said, I want to introduce our speakers for this evening. I'm very excited to have them here. It's actually taken a while to get this together, and I don't mean months, I'm talking in terms of years. So first I'll introduce our guest who came up here from the Heritage Foundation in Washington. His name is Paul Larkin. I'm going to have to read from my notes here. Paul Larkin is a lawyer in the Meese Center, which is part of the Institute for Constitutional Government. Paul is an expert on the criminal justice system, but he's also responsible for drug law and policy, administrative law and policy, and economic liberties law and policy. Before joining Heritage in September 2011, Paul held various positions with the federal government and at the U.S. Department of Justice from 1984 to 1993. He served as the assistant to the Solicitor General and argued 27 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. He was also an attorney in the Criminal Division's Organized Crime and Racketeering Section. In 1996 to 1997, Paul served as counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee and headed the crime unit for Senator Orrin Hatch, then the panel's chairman. He worked in the Environmental Protection Agency from 1998 to 2004 as a special agent for criminal enforcement, eventually becoming special agent in charge and serving as acting director of the EPA Criminal Investigation Division in 2004. His honors include the Secretary of Defense Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service, which he received in 1994 for representing the military before the Supreme Court. In the private sector, he worked at two top law firms in D.C. and an assistant general counsel for Verizon Communications from 2004 to 2009. Paul received his law degree in 1980 from Stanford Law School, where he was a published member of the Stanford Law Review. He clerked for Judge Robert H. Berk of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Court. In 2010, he received a master's degree in public policy from George Washington University. He also holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy from Washington and Lee University, where he graduated summa cum laude with honors in philosophy. Now, you know, I had to read off of that. There's no way I was going to remember all that. Second speaker, for those of you who are Penn students, is Professor Richard Berk. He's the chair of the Criminology Department here. He has appointments in not only the Department of Criminology and the Department of Statistics. He works on various topics and applies statistics, including causal inference, statistical machine learning, and methods for evaluating social programs. Among his criminology applications are inmate classification and placement systems, law enforcement strategies for reducing intimate partner violence, detecting violations of environmental or worker safety regulations, claims that the death penalty serves as a general deterrent, and forecasts of criminal behavior and/or victimization using statistical machine learning procedures. Some of his recent consulting have been with the Philadelphia Adult Department of Probation and Parole, Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole, Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, Washington, D.C. Police Department and Child Protective Services, Maryland Department of Human Resources, United States District Court for Eastern District of California, U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, and the Philadelphia Police Department, which I should remember. I'm a former member. I'm a former Philadelphia police officer. I should mention that. Professional awards: elected to the Sociological Research Association, elected fellow to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Paul S. Lazarsfeld Award for methodological contributions from the American Sociological Association, and he's elected fellow of the American Statistical Association and elected fellow of the Academy of Experimental Criminology. So that tells you that I said we have two very, very dynamic speakers here this evening and very interesting speakers, and this should be a very enlightening and entertaining talk. What I would like to do, initially we're going to do a formal symposium where everybody made opening statements, but I want to change that to just a general conversation where the three of us kind of talk to one another in a very informal way and field questions from you, the audience. But first, since I did ask them to come up with opening statements, I want them to at least be able to say what I asked them to do. So first we'll start with Paul.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, you want to go first or you want to
I can't. I don't care. I'm field choice to you.
Okay.
You can flip a coin.
Okay.
Okay, we're good. The question is incarceration in the age of Trump. And the answer is, who knows? Some of you may have been following the fate of the first step legislation in the House, which has had a back and forth between the Senate and the House of Representatives. Trump has sometimes spoken in favor of it, sometimes not. This afternoon he spoke in favor of it, but then Mitch McConnell said, in effect, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to go through the politics of that because I'm not an expert, but I just want to make a real simple point to start, which is there's basically overall confusion about what's going on, what's being recommended, and there's going to be no simple storyline. I want to start out, though, by reminding you, and we were just talking, I shouldn't have to remind you, why we have prisons. And let me just give you a couple of statistics from Philadelphia. In the Inquirer 2 days ago, we learned that there's over 300 homicides already in Philadelphia, and the clearance rate is about 30%. The usual multiplier between homicides and shootings is somewhere between 5 and 10. That means in Philadelphia so far this year, about 2,000 people have been shot. Okay? Of those shootings, 120 were school-aged children. That was this summer. It's probably higher now. That's more school-aged children shot in Philadelphia than for all the mass shootings in schools that have occurred this year. Okay? When you hear those statistics, there should be no debate that we got to get some people off the streets, that it's important to protect victims. Where it gets more complicated is that it's a well-known fact in criminal justice that people prey on people like themselves. What that means, for example, is African-American males who are young, their leading cause of death is homicide. If you look at the data, there's nothing else close. If you draw a graph, they're off the top of the paper. That is by far the leading cause of death for any subgroup. By and large, the perpetrators of those homicides are other young African-American males. When you start raising these racial issues, the need to get the bad guys off the street becomes much more complicated and much more controversial. In addition to that, when you get people off the streets, there's all sorts of collateral costs. It costs money. I don't know how many of you realize, but a year in a maximum security prison costs twice Penn tuition. To build a new maximum security cell is several $100,000. Now, I'd like to think that a lot of the concern about prison reform comes about from humanitarian concerns, but the fact is a lot of this is triggered by these sorts of costs. And then there's collateral damage to the offender's family, to the community that cannot be ignored, and often is. It gets complicated because, again, race is embedded in all this stuff. So we have this First Step Act, which I thought would be a good way of summarizing how we are currently responding in the age of Trump through incarceration to these kinds of facts. It's a very hard piece of legislation to understand because of the old saying that a camel is a horse made by committee. Same with this legislation. It's got all sorts of partial phrases, incomplete ideas, self-contradictory ideas that are not well thought out. And it's hard to figure out exactly what the goals are. I think most people, when looking at it, would say it sort of leans, quote, progressive. But if you look at what actually is being proposed, it's nothing. They're fiddling around the margins. Let me give you a sense of some of the things they're proposing. They're talking about providing better incentives for inmates in prison to participate in rehabilitation programs. Those incentives just mean more phone calls or more trips to the commissary. It's not like they are providing very, very strong incentives. They talk about having better educational and vocational training programs. Surely, in principle, that's a good idea. The fact is we don't know very well how to do that. They claim to be evidence-based, and there isn't a lot of evidence for how we rehabilitate or how we educate in prison. There is a resurrection of the Fair Sentencing Act, which is meant to equate the sentences for trafficking in powdered cocaine with crack cocaine. I can give the history of that, but there has been a long period of time, decades, in which the penalties for crack cocaine for the same kind of impact were much stiffer than for powder. And there's a lot of reasons why that happened. But there's obviously racial implications for that, depending on who uses crack and who uses powder. There's a bit of an effort to reduce mandatory minimums, but only for second and third offenders who are involved in drugs. Other kinds of crimes, apparently not. I have to say that this is a moving target. These things are changing almost daily as negotiations are going forward. There's a stronger safety valve which allows judges to basically overrule mandatory minimums. It's not a big deal, but it is something that could lead to shorter sentences. There's also an increase in good time from 47 to 54 days per year. Doesn't sound like much, and it isn't. But again, these are only for, quote, low-risk inmates and those individuals who are shown to be participating in rehabilitation programs. What does that good time lead to? You are released, but still, as they say, pre-release custody. So you're released from jail, but you're still under supervision, which means you're in a halfway house or some rough equivalent of parole, where you have, for example, restrictions on where you can go and why. There's also, and I'm happy about this in principle, a call for rigorous needs assessment tools and risk assessment tools. That's what I do, and I could talk at length about that. Let me just give you an important distinction. Risk assessment tools are basically forecasting devices, where the idea is to anticipate future dangerousness. And we know how to do that pretty well with machine learning with the kinds of data that are routinely available. Needs assessment tools are not about forecasting risk. They're about providing information on the kinds of interventions that would be most effective for a given inmate, for example, drug rehab. They do different things. They sound a lot alike, but they really are fundamentally aiming at different purposes. In both of those cases, one of the problems is that there are existing tools for this that are decades old that don't do a very good job. But they're nevertheless embedded. Some of you may have heard about, for example, the LSIR, and there are other instruments like that that don't do a very good job. So when there's a call here for risk assessment and needs assessment at federal level, my first reaction is it going to be the same old garbage, or are we going to do it right? And we can't tell from the legislation. Excuse me?
I can make a prediction.
Make your prediction.
It was the same old garbage.
That's always the same prediction, isn't it? Yes, that's likely. There's a number of people pushing back, but you're right, that's a good bet. What's not addressed? You got to appreciate, of course, this is federal. 90% of the inmates in the United States are in state prisons, and local jails. So this doesn't touch that. It also doesn't touch the sentencing guidelines. We were talking before about the impact of sentencing guidelines, which in effect tell judges a range of sentence that should be appropriate for a given kind of offender, for a given kind of crime. Those are left untouched. And of course, when you're sentencing, those are obviously a key determinant of the sentence length, which in turn affects how long people are in prison. There is no concern yet at the federal level with wholesale release. What's happening in a number of state jurisdictions is they make the following kind of observation. Person's already served a fair amount of time. What's the problem with releasing him 6 months early? That saves me $25,000 an inmate. The concern, of course, is that crime rates will increase. Turns out, probably not at the rate in which we're doing it. We don't know for sure. And the reason why is, if you think about it, you're talking about releasing, let's just take Pennsylvania. You're talking about releasing 300 or 400 inmates spread around the state, let's say a lot in Philadelphia and a lot in Pittsburgh, maybe some in Harrisburg. In any given community, only 1 or 2 are going to wind up there. That's not going to measurably affect the crime rate, given all the other things that affect the crime rate. So it's a pretty safe bet that this is noise. This concern, however, about impacting the crime rate and the possibility of wholesale release isn't addressed, or even how you determine who should be released. I mean, people like me at my age, I should be released. People with terminal illnesses probably should be released. What about other sorts of offenders? And there hasn't been really sorted out. Risk assessment tools would help. And finally, and I think very importantly, the First Step Act does not address costs. It's kind of ironic because that's a lot of the motivation for getting these reforms discussed. There's no talk about constraining costs or using dollars more efficiently, and we actually have some ideas on how you can do that. So, bottom line, what would I do? What would my recommendations be? First, you got to make crime prevention your top priority. People are incarcerated because of retribution and other sort of moral features of their crime. That's part of the way we are, and it's important, but I think the highest priority should be crime prevention because that's the way we protect victims. Feeling good about putting somebody away for 30 years doesn't make anybody safer necessarily. If you can show those 30 years save lives, now you've got an argument in my point of view. The second is, when we talk about these kinds of reforms, we should pick the low-hanging fruit. There are, in fact, a number of people in prison who are probably very good risks. And there are a number of those people who would benefit from the kinds of programs that we're talking about. We shouldn't imagine that we can reform, rehabilitate, educate a number of the real bad guys that are in prison. Save that for another day. That's much harder. But there's lots of low-hanging fruit that we can work on, and we should make that a priority. Third recommendation is take costs seriously. Again, that's what started the debate. We know how to do this more efficiently than it's currently done, and it's ignored in this act and more generally. And then finally, a more general point about criminal justice. We should be investing much more in the front end of criminal justice. We know pretty certainly from a lot of research that the way to deter people is having punishment that's swift and sure. The severity of the punishment after that is far less important. Well, how do you make punishments swift and sure when the clearance rate reported a couple of days ago for homicide is 30%? It's certainly not sure, and it's certainly not swift. But with smarter use of resources at the front end, which we know how to do, and more investment in the front end rather than the back end, we can probably have a greater impact on making the community safer. Thanks.
I can walk around and use this thing, but I feel like Phil Donahue every time I do that. And I think I can talk loud enough without it.
Record.
Oh, you need it for the recording? Okay, well, then I'll put up with looking like, I'll put it up with looking like Phil Donahue then.
Perfect. Let me start out by saying thank you. I appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you. And I appreciate your coming here. There's a lot of things you have that compete for your time, particularly on a Friday evening. It's kind of you to be willing to share some of that time with us, Federalist Society, the Penn Statesman, so that you can give us the opportunity to give you the benefit of some of our thinking about criminal justice matters. So thank you very much. Now, the title is Incarceration in the Age of Trump. And my panel member, the professor, has looked at it from the perspective of some of the legislation that's going through and how this will affect the incarceration rate and how it should affect it, because it could have improvements and it could not. So you have to look at things in balance. I'm going to look at this issue from a slightly different perspective. In order to determine whether we are incarcerating too many people, we have to decide what we should be incarcerating people for. Because we're not, for example, incarcerating too many if we're incarcerating the right people for the right crimes. It's true, the federal government has seen a tremendous increase in the number of people it has confined over the last 40+ years. On its face, that gives you pause. You would want to ask yourself, why do we have this tremendous increase? Were things really that bad before that we needed to have this tremendous increase now in order to improve the situation? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But what it seems to me is we need to ask ourselves 3 questions. And ironically, this is the perfect opportunity to ask ourselves those questions. Okay? Why? Well, the questions all relate to the future focus of federal law enforcement and the judgments necessary about its effectiveness. And we have the perfect opportunity right now because today President Trump announced that Bill Barr will be his nominee for the position of Attorney General. The Attorney General has 3 responsibilities. One is he has to manage the Justice Department and all of the lawyers and agents and associated personnel that go with that. Second, he has the responsibility for giving legal advice to people in the federal government, in the White House, in the other agencies, and the like. But thirdly, an informal responsibility he has is to be what people often say is to be the nation's chief law enforcement officer. And that gives him the ability, through moral suasion, through argument, through demonstration, to say what we should be doing in the United States to ensure domestic tranquility. That's what the Constitution says is a reason why we founded the nation. And if the Attorney General is in fact the nation's chief law enforcement officer, as I think, and I think most people do, it is important to take the opportunity we have now that there will be a new Attorney General to identify the questions that we want him to ask. And there are 3, I think, and they go to this issue. Question 1, on what crimes should the federal government focus? Okay. Question 2, which federal law enforcement agency should be responsible for each category of those offenses? Question 3, how do we measure our success at enforcing the law and making the United States a safer place, ensuring domestic tranquility? Let me take them in that order, okay? Question 1, on what offenses should the federal government focus? Now, you might think that's easy. Just look at the federal code. Those of you who are lawyers know that all federal crimes have to be statutory. Courts can't create them. Only Congress can pass a criminal statute. A footnote to that would be the ability of agencies to adopt regulations defining terms and statutes, but let's leave that aside for a minute. So you would think you could look to the U.S. Code. In 1791, you could have. The first Crimes Act passed about 1791, created between 20 and 30 crimes. And they were exactly the type of crimes you would expect that a new nation needed to get up and running. Assaults on personnel, okay? Crimes on the high seas, piracy. Piracy is essentially murder and robbery on the high seas. It's a very nice term for that. Crimes like that. Well, nowadays, we've gone well beyond that. There are thousands of federal offenses out there. And agencies can add to them with regulations, creating hundreds of thousands of regulations that are relevant to what is a crime. And if you think they make sense, then you just haven't been looking hard enough, okay? It is a crime to assault the President of the United States and to harass the Western sage grouse. It is a crime to counterfeit U.S. currency and to misuse the Smokey the Bear emblem. It is a crime to transport heroin in interstate commerce and to transport dentures not given you by a dentist across state lines. Essentially, if you look at the federal code, you can't, I think, avoid coming away with the conclusion that Congress has not legislated with the public safety in mind. It has, as public choice theorists would say, legislated to satisfy various interest groups. So the code is not helpful. So the better way to look at it is structural. Why did we have a federal government? And that's because the states could not manage, without benefiting themselves, under the Articles of Confederation to govern the nation. There was no executive. And the states, every time they did something, it was to benefit the people in South Carolina or in Massachusetts or New York or whatever. So they created a federal government so there'd be somebody to look out for the interests of the entire nation. And what then are the types of interests that only the federal government, as a matter of criminal justice, can effectively handle? Okay? Domestic and international terrorism, political and economic espionage, cyber crimes, international and interstate white-collar crimes, civil rights violations, environmental crimes, public corruption, and maybe one or two others, such as assaults on officials of foreign governments. Only the federal government can handle those crimes, in part because only the federal government has the contacts and the resources to deal with something that involves conduct that occurred in part in another nation or that occurred in California, even if the crime had an effect in Florida. Okay? The FBI has 80 overseas legats in order to try to deal with the need to deal with foreign law enforcement. No local sheriff's department has that. Not even a place like the NYPD has as many overseas offices as the FBI. So those is just one example. Now, take civil rights crimes, local corruption, environmental crimes. The federal government has to handle those. Why? If a federal agent investigates those, he or she is not going to lose his or her job. If a state or local cop does, you can bet your bottom dollar that person is going to be a goner pretty soon.
Well, on that theory, who would investigate federal corruption?
The federal government has to be in the position to do that.
Its own corruption.
That's right. And if you take a look at the way we've done it throughout history, yes, there has been federal corruption. There was the Teapot Dome. There was Watergate. And who investigated those? Federal law enforcement, not the states, not the locals. You can say what you want about the federal government's difficulties investigating itself, but there is very little alternative if you wanted to go that route. And secondly, the people who are doing it, the people actually doing the jobs of the investigation, are not going to get fired because they're doing it. If there's any problem, it occurs at the upper level where people at the top of an organization are not doing what they should. But in terms of the federal government investigating the federal government, you in part have the rule of necessity. There is no one else who can do it. And you also have a pretty good track record of the federal government being able to do it. I don't think you could make the same claim about the locals investigating political corruption, civil rights violation, and environmental crimes. So, yes, that is an issue, but there are, I think, answers to it. And then there are other sorts of matters that you want the federal government to handle, anything dealing with a foreign government. Do you really want a local sheriff to be making decisions that have foreign policy consequences? Do you really think that yesterday, when the Canadian officials arrested an official from a major Chinese corporation in Canada, that it was because the sheriff of Mayberry called them up and asked them to do it? Okay? Those have very significant consequences for the nation as a whole, and the nation as a whole has to be responsible for doing that. Now, that is one of the areas at which we need to address in this regard. The second is which agency is going to do what. The truth is, federal law enforcement, at least its infrastructure, has grown up in a rather haphazard manner. The first two federal law enforcement agencies were the Marshal Service and the Customs Service. The Marshal Service were like sheriffs, which you had in England and you had in the colonies. The Customs Service was necessary because the federal government funded itself by customs duties and selling public land. There was no income tax. So if you wanted the federal government to be able to do something and you wanted them to have the money to do it, you needed some way of doing it, and therefore you needed somebody to enforce those laws. Now, however, we have almost more law enforcement agencies than you can shake a stick at. And they've grown up, like I said, in sort of a random manner. The best known agency is probably the FBI, which started out as the Bureau of Investigation, where all they did were background investigations. They had no law enforcement authority whatsoever. In fact, even when they started under Herbert Hoover investigating law enforcement cases, they weren't authorized to carry firearms. Congress had to pass a statute to allow them to do that because they were doing it in other states. They, over time, have developed the broadest jurisdiction of any federal law enforcement agency to the point where they do a little of everything. And that's a problem because the FBI essentially has become the Walmart of federal law enforcement. They do so many different things that they have effectively spread themselves very thinly. Now, they do a lot of white-collar crime, but they don't do counterfeiting. Who does that? The Secret Service. Why? The Secret Service was created after the Civil War. Those of you who are law students or are lawyers, you're familiar with the 14th Amendment. Read the parts of the 14th Amendment they never talk about in law school class, where it says the United States government will not be responsible for any of the debts that were incurred by the rebellious states, okay? And the rebellious states' currency, therefore, was not any good either. So how did the South try to survive when its currency was gone and the federal government wasn't paying for the debts? They started printing money. And the Secret Service was created to address that. They only got the personal security responsibility for the president and the like after McKinley was assassinated. But they have that now. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives were the original revenue agents. Think Eliot Ness and the Untouchables. They started out in the Treasury Department. They now wound up in the Justice Department because of the reorganization after 9/11. But it's not clear what function they're doing. They really are supposed to be originally investigating things on which the federal government imposed a tax, like cigarettes, okay? Alcohol, remember they were the original revenue agents. That has had an uneasy relationship with all the other responsibilities that agencies have. The DEA also started out in the Treasury Department. At one time it was the Bureau of Narcotics, and then the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and became part of the Justice Department only after a reorganization in the 1970s when Nixon was the president. We have inspector general's offices who are supposed to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse in all the different agencies in the federal government. And the agents in the inspector general's offices have general law enforcement authority. They have the ability to make arrests, to execute search warrants, issue subpoenas, investigate cases, carry firearms. Those are sort of the basics of what law enforcement officers do. And then, beginning in the New Deal, we had the creation of a large number of regulatory agencies. And oftentimes, rather than give law enforcement responsibility to the FBI or somebody else, they created regulatory programs within these regulatory agencies. Now, my own view is that that's a terrible mistake for a bunch of reasons. And I have some personal experience in that because I was, for a while, in the criminal program at the EPA. But nonetheless, what you have never had is somebody sort of step back and say, is this the right infrastructure? Do we want all of this spread out in all these different ways? Now that, I don't think is as important as the first question I mentioned, on what crimes should the federal government focus and leave the rest to the states. Okay? But it is an important matter you need to look into if you're going to take up that first issue and then the third one that I mentioned. The third one, how do we know we are being successful? Historically, what we've done in law enforcement is measure inputs and outputs. How many dollars did Congress give an agency? How many cases did the agency open? How many arrests were made? How many charges were brought? How many convictions were there as a result? What were the length of terms of imprisonment? What was the amount of fine, amount of monies that were forfeited? Those are outputs. They are not outcomes. What we've had a dickens of a time trying to figure out, and therefore effectively everybody has tried to avoid asking the question, is whether we have reduced the crime rate. Whether people feel more secure in their person and finances as a result of what the federal government has done. Now, localities have it much easier in this regard than the federal government. Localities, first of all, have a dramatically smaller footprint than the federal government does. But more importantly, they can look within that footprint at a variety of different types of factors to see if their law enforcement efforts are succeeding. For example, what is the average income in a precinct, which is how law enforcement is broken down in New York City, where I grew up? Is it rising or falling? What is the population in this precinct? Is it rising or falling? What number of businesses have opened or closed? How long have vacant properties remained vacant rather than be occupied by a new business? Are there just empty spaces that have become garbage dumps? Are the streets strewn with garbage? How many people are out on the street at night? Which gives you some evidence of how secure people might feel in these neighborhoods. Those are all factors that, for example, were caught up in what was known as the broken windows theory of policing. But those are factors that a local police department can use to decide whether it's successful in dealing with crime. Am I going on too long?
No, I just had to ask him a question about something you said. Just keep in mind that you got to catch your...
No, I understand, and I will wrap up. They are very difficult to translate into factors the federal government should look at. For example, the federal government has various arms export laws. You need a permit to sell a variety of different products, from rifles to computer software to various other countries. If you are stricter in what you allow out and you prosecute more cases who violate it, it is incredibly difficult to know whether you've had any effect, in part because there are two questions you have to ask and answer. What is the crime rate doing? Is it going down or is it going up? Now, to some extent, you have the problem that Donald Rumsfeld talked about when he said known unknowns. We don't know how many crimes there were in year one, because if we did, in theory, we should be able to point to that by number of cases opened or the like. So if you don't know how many are being committed in year one and you pursue a policy for years 2, 3, 4, and 5, how do you know if that policy has been effective in terms of reducing the amount of crime? It's very difficult to make that sort of assessment when you're not talking about crimes that have easily identifiable factors. And then secondly, you've also got to ask yourself, what effect is the federal government alone having on crime? Is the federal government, for example, in the area of drug trafficking, able to point to factors that only the federal government was involved in and not the states and the locals? Because there are various crimes that you should just allow the states and locals to handle, and most small-scale, probably even medium-scale drug trafficking, you should leave to the locals. They can handle that. Another one, for example, felon in possession of a firearm, called FIPS in the trade. Those are cases the states and locals should handle. I mean, how hard is it to prove a case like that? You put the officer on the stand, he says, yes, I arrested John Smith. Did he, what, if anything, did you take off him when you were arrested? Well, I found this firearm. Okay. What can you tell me about the firearm? He goes through the data. And tell me also, was John Smith ever convicted of a crime? Yes, here, in fact, is the prison report showing the judgment and conviction order entered by the court. Okay? How hard is that to prove? A 1L could prove that case. So there are a variety of different...
Excuse me, it shouldn't make any difference, in theory, I suppose, whether a crime is within the federal jurisdiction or the state jurisdiction, depending on how easy it is to convict or to prove. Or
No.
how hard it is. That should be irrelevant, shouldn't it?
No, it should be relevant. If it's that easy to prove, why waste the time of federal agents who can only handle the crimes I mentioned earlier? You've got X number of federal agents, they have Y number of hours to devote to various different types of crimes. Why would you want them to investigate and handle cases and crimes that the states and locals can handle? Okay? The states and locals can't handle cybercrime. They can't handle interstate crime, international crime. They can't handle crimes involving foreign governments or foreign officials. They can't handle terrorism, whether domestic or international. They can't handle espionage. You got a limited number of resources, and the people that you want to handle those are the people who are best capable of doing it. The feds are. Okay? The states can handle FIPS, so you let them handle it. Besides, the reason the states want the feds to handle FIPS is because this way, if the feds handle it and they incarcerate them, they have to pay for it. That's what's going on and why the feds will push back. Let me wrap it up, and then you'll have questions for all of us. The three questions I mentioned: what crimes on which we should focus, what federal law enforcement agency should do it, and how do we measure success, I think are three questions we need to ask. And we have the perfect opportunity now because we have a new Attorney General nominee. And I think this is a very propitious time for us to go into those questions. Thank you.
I told you we have really two dynamic speakers. I'm going to channel my inner Phil Donahue, and I would like to throw have the audience ask questions. So anybody has a question, please let me know. Going once. Okay. Keep the microphone because, like I said, you have to get on the video here.
Thank you, gentlemen. So I guess just as a follow-up to the most recent interlocution, my more significant concern, I would think, would not be just the resource constraints for federal officers and federal dollars, but if we're going to meaningfully preserve the federal system, and I don't think anybody from anywhere along the, except maybe at the extreme margins of the political spectrum, thinks we should do away with the federal system, then there should be a jurisdictional requirement that federal officers be, legitimately be a federal question involved. It shouldn't just be, oh, this is a tough case, let's let the feds handle it.
Need the mic.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm glad to answer.
Like you said, you wanted to make sure you get
Okay. True, but it doesn't mean that the federal government should never be involved in those street crimes. For example, street crimes are predicate acts under the RICO statute. And if you're investigating large-scale organized crime, those crimes are worth considering as part of the investigative apparatus. A lot of different drug transactions may be small in nature, but if you have somebody further up the food chain who is responsible for it all, then you may have a continuing criminal enterprise. There are times where you want the federal government to be involved in these things. The sniper cases, they were just standard murder cases, but they involved, neighboring jurisdictions, and the state and locals didn't have a fix on it. It helped to have the FBI involved because they have jurisdiction over more than one state. So there are times that it makes sense to have the federal government involved in these things. But you're right. If you're going to have a federal system, you need to have an allocation of responsibility. And the federal government should focus on the ones that only the federal government can handle. I
think that's the right way. But it doesn't mean the federal government should never investigate a local homicide.
Anybody else?
You mentioned that there are a number of regulations, in fact, a very great number of regulations that create criminal offenses or modify them in a certain way. Does that violate the principle that the law should be known, the criminal law in particular, should be known what's prohibited on the theory that otherwise you might inadvertently commit a crime? And if that's true, wouldn't that mean an awful lot of things have to be repealed?
The answers are yes and no. Think for a minute. The average person in the United States does not have a college education. Okay? You all are above average in that regard. What does that mean? It means the average person isn't familiar with what goes into the U.S. Code, isn't familiar with what goes into the set of regulations we call the Code of Federal Regulations. You are familiar with that. But you know what? Unless you practice in a particular area, you're not going to know them all. And in truth, no judge, no law professor, no lawyer is going to know them all. So if we're going to use the regulatory process to govern behavior, we have to be willing to recognize that there are limits on the knowledge of the average person. Now, what legal doctrine comes into play in that regard? There's a doctrine called the void for vagueness doctrine. It says that if a legislature writes a statute in a manner that renders it so vague the average person doesn't know what the statute means, then the statute can't be enforced criminally. We're not going to send people to jail for violating a statute where they don't know what it means. Well, if that's true, then it seems to me that it follows that if we're going to have limitations on the analytical and reading ability of the average individual, we ought to have parallel limitations on their ability to know all these different things. Now, does that mean you have to repeal all these regulations? No. You don't need to repeal them. What is the problem? The problem is the average person isn't going to know whether the conduct charged against him is a crime. How do you address that? Yes, you could repeal them all, but as a practical matter, it's not going to happen, and as a legal matter, it doesn't have to. The way you deal with that is creating a mistake of law defense. You allow a defendant to raise the defense that no reasonable person, and he or she, him or herself, would have known that the conduct charged against me was a crime. If you violate some obscure regulation that no reasonable person would have known existed, and you didn't know that what you're doing is a crime, you can raise this defense, and you should be fully exonerated if you can prove it to the satisfaction of the trier of fact. So yes, there is a problem with knowledge of the law. But no, you don't have to get rid of all the regulations. You just have to allow someone to show that no reasonable person would have known that this was a crime, and that I didn't know this was a crime. If you can make those two showings, then you should be exculpated.
Anybody else? All right, I want to ask you a question to the audience. Has anybody here ever been in prison? Or knows anybody that's been in prison?
Visiting or otherwise?
Otherwise. Okay, all right, so. There's a great deal of talk, and I know Richard mentioned this, about the costs of incarceration. And I think Paul touched on it as well. What never seems to be brought into in the equation is, what is the cost of crime? What is the cost to the victims? Does anybody have any idea what those are? You do?
Oh, I'm imagining and knowing. So.
Well, what do you think what do you think it would be?
Mostly employment.
Employment?
Life.
Your life, okay. Your quality of life, okay. Anything else?
Cost is in the hundreds of billions, but okay, that's what it is.
Well, some studies have been done. A couple out of Eastern Kentucky University, another one out of University of Nebraska. They've done some studies. What happens? What does the cost of somebody who's murdered? Anybody know? Anybody have an idea?
There's been studies in that too. They use proxies.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah, the costs come in several different flavors. There's the cost to the victim, and people have used proxies like how much insurance would pay if they had a life insurance policy. We can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Then you're right, there are costs if a person is in prison, comes out, can't find a job. There's also increasing evidence of psychological damage in prison, so that there's actually lots of different ways in which people have aggregated the costs, but there's no definitive figure, and we're probably not going to get one, but it's big.
Well, what about things like having to lock your door every night? Having burglar alarms, car alarms, that type of thing. Does anybody consider those, putting locks on your windows? These are simple things, but they add up. And I don't think anybody really seems to take that into consideration. Yes, sir.
Increase the gross national product.
What about the cost to the victims? A rape victim is going to suffer for the rest of their lives. Psychological damage, maybe psychiatric treatment, the effect on them, their families. This isn't taken into consideration to a great extent on sentencing, because they talk about the poor criminal, and they bring the family out to say he was a good boy, he never killed anybody before.
I mean, that's a very good point, but these days, very commonly, the victim, the victim's family, victim's friends can come to court and make the case about how horrific a crime was. Whether that gets the job done is difficult to tell for the reason you mentioned. We don't know what that cost is, although it could be enormous.
One other thing, a fair number of the crimes that the federal government deals with are very difficult to quantify in terms of the cost to the victim. You violate even the controlled substances laws, for example. It's difficult to figure out how many people are victims and what the individual cost was for each one. If you talk about the arms control laws, you're talking about a loss of the ability of the government to defend itself. It's unquantifiable. So it's easier to quantify those numbers in the case of the old-fashioned common law crimes, which are the ones the states have. And as my colleague pointed out, the federal and state governments nowadays are pretty good about allowing victims to come in. And a judge should take that into account, because that is part of the harm that not only the victim but the community has suffered. Why? Because a cost that is incredibly difficult to calculate, but that is doubtless that occurs every time there's a crime, is the decreased sense of security that people have. If you're a young woman in a building where you hear that somebody else was raped, that person has suffered costs, obviously. But so does the woman who heard about it and all the other young women in that building. They feel less secure. That costs them.
And it's worse. There's all sorts of research these days about what happens to kids in high crime neighborhoods when they see people shot or people beaten or raped, or they know somebody who was. It actually rewires your brain. And it may take years to unravel the damage to witnesses, to bystanders, not just to the victim, but everybody else who's involved. There's now increasing work in Pennsylvania and elsewhere to help articulate what those damages are and trying to provide some sorts of remedies. But it's really, really tough because the damage, I guess, literally physical.
Anyone else? Before I let me just do one thing here and shut off my phone, obviously. You both mentioned the cost of incarceration, and you talked about nonviolent offenders, correct? And that's a phrase I hear a lot, about nonviolent offenders. Usually by that they mean a drug offender. Right?
Like Bernie Madoff.
Yeah, okay. But by that definition, okay, because they're going by what they were convicted, reason for conviction. By that definition, Al Capone is a nonviolent offender, okay? John Gotti was a nonviolent offender. Okay? So how in the world, excuse me for this, how in the world can you say that nonviolent offenders are really nonviolent? It's only by what they were convicted for, and you can't use that judgment. Anybody have an answer to that? You want to go to that? Well, you both do, because I know. Go ahead and start.
Yeah, the term nonviolent offender usually refers to the offense of conviction. But any criminal justice professional will tell you that far more important than the offense of conviction is the pre-sentence report, because it goes into detail about all the other crimes someone has committed, that person's criminal history and the like.
Tell the jury about it.
Well, even if you could, you're not going to be going into what a person did 10 years ago when he's charged with a particular crime that occurred in 2018. But it's relevant to what the sentence should be, and if the judge is the one doing the sentencing, then it certainly is going to come in there. Take drug cases. I mean, oftentimes the reason people will plead guilty to a drug possession charge is because the sentence is long enough that it adequately responds to the community's need without having to show all the murders that somebody committed in the course of his criminal career. So if you possess a certain amount of heroin, you're going to go away or be eligible for 20 years. If you killed 5 people in the course of it, well, that's 5 homicides you'd have to prove, and maybe you wouldn't get any more than the same 20 years. So people will accept the plea because it reduces their exposure, and the government will offer it because it guarantees them a certain minimum sentence without having to go through complications. But if you look at the judgment of conviction, not the pre-sentence report, all you'll see is possession of a controlled substance.
Thank you for asking that. I didn't ask you to ask it, but thank you. State of Pennsylvania passed a law 2 or 3 years ago which requires quantitative risk assessments given to judges before they sentence. Those assessments take into account what's in the pre-sentencing report and tons more, and we've shown them to be quite accurate. They can tell you, not perfectly, but quite well whether someone is low risk or not. The same thing is true of the parole board here in Pennsylvania. They use an algorithmic risk assessment tool which addresses the kind of crime a person is likely to be convicted of. We do a pretty good job in predicting that, and that's how I think about low risk offenders. It is certainly true that there will be individuals who that will be misclassified. Maybe Al Capone would have been one of them.
So I get to be the guy that asked the question at the very end of the seminar, but I was piqued, my curiosity was piqued by Professor Berk's comments about prevention. And I'm wondering what factors would best be employed to successfully prevent crime. I think that probably the cop on the beat who, is there at sort of the last stop before, that's the individual that the otherwise, ersatz criminal sees right before he or she commits the crime. I don't think that's fully successful prevention. And I'm wondering to what extent we're kind of taking the baby with a hammer approach. Everything looks like a nail, and so it's got to be the government, it's got to be law enforcement, is it federal, is it state, whatever. I'm curious to what extent you gentlemen think that the decay, let's say, of the strength of other institutions in our society have contributed to the underlying factors.
Okay, let me respond a little bit anyway.
It's a hard question. I just
You got to think about it a little bit. You talked about law enforcement and having, the cop on the corner, that kind of thing. And as a former police officer who worked not too far from here at Southwest Philadelphia, back in the early 80s when it was what they used to call a busy district. It was called the Fightin' 12th because of the proclivity of the residents there to fight police officers. So that gives you kind of an idea what the neighborhood was like. The East End was black, the white end was white. What I saw was when I would make an arrest, and we were talking about this earlier, and I remember it was an aggravated assault, the guy stabbed a woman in the back, and brought to court, and I'm sitting in the county. Have you been in a municipal court or a county court? Has anybody here been in a municipal or county court? Okay, I characterize them as zoos, okay, because they do some really bizarre things. Pardon?
You're so nice to them.
Well, they're bizarre. If you've never been in one, it's an experience. And this judge, case comes up, judge goes 2 years probation. Next case comes up, 2 years probation. Next case comes up, 2 years probation. And I turned around to the guy next to me and I said, I give you 10-1, he's going to give mine 2 years probation. So we get up, testify. Sure enough, judge says 2 years probation. Okay. That's the problem. You see, the police are only part of the system. And you have judges, you have parole, you have probation, you have corrections. And I always have a problem with parole boards who release people, especially violent offenders, that commit violent offenses again. I think the Bureau of Justice Statistics just came out with a study as of 2016. Those under sentence of death, I think about 10% of them had one prior murder conviction. Now think about that for a second. One prior murder conviction. I was under the impression if you committed a murder, you weren't getting out of jail. Okay? I think the average length of sentence,
Talked about that.
yeah, it was like about 12 years, something like that.
Yeah.
For a murder. Okay? So Richard has some things to say about that, and I'd like to go ahead and give some time to think. Go ahead.
That's another discussion, but I want to try to respond to your very challenging question. I wish we knew. What we do know is there's lots of little things which help, and presumably if we could do all of them or a large fraction of them, and I'll give you some ideas, we can reduce crime by preventing it. I made a point earlier that we do know that swift and sure punishment is more important than the severity. That means working with police. You mentioned cop on the beat. One of the ways we get swift and sure is we have police who are well respected in the community and can bring witnesses forward. There's lots of things that can be done there. It's not a cure-all. The other point I wanted to make was that a study I've just completed with some folks, colleagues of mine in Oslo, Norway. Some of you may know that Scandinavian countries have these registries which collect from birth, actually before birth, all kinds of information that we don't allow to be assembled here in the United States. So we posed the following question: could you predict before a child was born the probability they would commit a crime by age 18? And the answer is yes, remarkably so. If you think about it a bit, it's not so crazy, but it sounds Orwellian, I know. We can do that. One of the implications, and this is consistent with some very good research, is that we need, if we're going to prevent, to consider intervening early. And there have been experiments to do the following sorts of things. They bring nurses to the home of the pregnant mother to do parent training, to help with nutrition. When the child is born, immediately trying to intervene by getting proper parenting done, proper nutrition for the child as well. And there's been randomized trials like you would do for a vaccine, which show that these, in fact, reduce substantially, they followed people for years, subsequent misconduct and violent crime. So there's not one thing, there's probably 30 or 40 things, all of which there's research suggesting could help, but it would take a full court press around all those issues, I think, to get the kind of impact that all of us would like to have.
About the economics of that.
Well, I have it down here. I was going to mention it. Thank you. There is some pretty good evidence that jobs matter. And when people get out of prison, there's some pretty good evidence that if people can find jobs that allow them to survive, that helps too. But it's not by itself the end all. These are all sort of incremental things that we know help, but there's no one single answer. At each step, sort of from birth or before birth, all the way through. Remember, by the time someone gets to prison, they've lived a long life already. Prison is kind of the last stop on the train. Lots of things have happened before that for which we have options that we don't really exercise as we should. Now, you've got a list too, huh?
Yeah, let me just mention a couple of other things in this regard. One is the one problem in this regard of these sorts of concerns have to get filtered through a criminal justice system and through the political system. The problem is the costs are paid up front and the benefits come in much later, and they are more diffuse because there have been a lot of other things that have happened over time. So it's difficult to persuade people to spend money up front unless they can be sure there's going to be an immediate benefit. So part of the problem that we have to deal with in this regard is just a purely political one of trying to get these things done. But nonetheless, there are different types in the case of drug crimes. Sometimes treatment is better than imprisonment. And sometimes the best way to get somebody into treatment is through some involvement in the criminal justice system. Drug courts. Drug courts have their problems because they are very selective in who they are willing to take, but there are other programs too. There is the 24/7 sobriety program that was started by a judge in South Dakota by the name of Larry Long. There was the Hawaii Opportunity Probation with Enforcement, which was started by a Hawaii judge by the name of Steve Alm, that is now known as the HOPE program, Honest Opportunity for Probation with Enforcement. These are efforts to try to increase the certainty and celerity by, for example, putting people on probation, aggressively and randomly drug testing them, and if they test hot, they immediately go in, say, for 24 hours, or 48 hours, or 72 hours, with increasing periods. Because then the certainty and celerity is satisfied. Oftentimes what happened traditionally in probation was you'd violate the conditions of probation 12, 15 times before the PO would refer to the judge to do something, and then the judge would use a very heavy hand in sentencing somebody perhaps for the 5 years or whatever. This is designed to be very upfront. You call in, you find out that you have to come in for drug testing. Where does the drug testing done? At the jail. If you test hot, you don't leave, okay? That guarantees the certainty and severity right there. There are ways of trying to increase the likelihood that this will help by going after people who abscond and the like, but those are other options. Another problem, I think, is that over the last 40 years, American society has come to be told that self-sacrifice is for losers, and self-satisfaction, self-gratification is the summum bonum. Drugs are a good example. You shouldn't use drugs for a host of reasons, one of which is you are leaving yourself captive now to the effect of the drug that it has on the pleasure centers in the brain. Okay? The gratification comes immediately. The problems are further down the road. But if society is told you should enjoy yourself now and not sacrifice any potential immediate gratification for long-term benefits, it makes it harder for somebody to resist that sort of lure that the immediate gratification of a very powerful drug can offer. So part of it is reaching the minds of people before they start down this road, you know, and in that regard, try to help with prevention.
We could go on.
Yeah, no.
One thing that hasn't been addressed, oh, you've got it, time? No, please, go ahead.
I don't have a question. Wrap it up.
You're gonna wrap it up.
I asked a wrap-up question.
No, Paul's gonna have to leave it a little bit. But if you wanna leave now, you can. Well, one thing we haven't touched on is, and this is something that I know Richard works on a lot, is intimate partner violence, sex crimes. Anybody have any questions about that? Anybody would like to know something about that? No one? Ladies here, you don't? Okay.
The talk today is to reduce bail, to set people out without having, if they can't afford it, let them out anyway on their own recognizance. The question in my mind is there's a lot of merit, as I see it, in that. But I wonder whether there's also a demerit. Because a lot of the guys who can't get out on bail have swift and short punishment. That is, they're in jail pending trial. And to the extent you reduce that, you reduce what you both described and what was described even 50 years ago by Jim Wilson and Ed Banfield as the idea that criminals are deterred only if the punishment comes right away. If it comes in the future, they discount the future, as, for example, you were just saying. So I wonder whether the new movement on bail will have its negative effects.
I didn't ask you to ask that question either. That's also in my sweet spot. Here in Philadelphia, we're in the midst of a large bail reform initiative, as you know. And we have a couple of well-established facts to help us out. The first is that most of the people who fail to show because of oversight, or they can't get child care, or they can't afford to lose their job. And there's been some clinical trials which show, for example, that if you call them on their cell phone shortly before they're due, it increases the show-up rate. So we shouldn't be thinking that the folks who don't show up, which is the original motivation for bail, don't show up because they're somehow absconding. They just forgot, or they can't get transportation. In terms of the sanctioning that you're talking about, I'm uneasy with that because they haven't been convicted of anything yet. Sometimes they're barely charged. And so we really can't think of that, I think, properly as a deterrent. Even though it might be, we probably shouldn't do it.
The case gets discharged.
Excuse me?
When the case gets discharged.
Well, that's a different question. I mean, what happens is basically that either the magistrate thinks the cops didn't do their job, or the prosecutor sort of turns up his nose and said, I'm not going to charge him subsequently. That's a whole different matter. My main concern with the process in domestic violence, police talk about a revolving door. Police come in, make an arrest, they bring someone down, a couple hours, they're in jail. The next day they're out, they go home. Do you think the perpetrator is any more sympathetic to the person who reported him? And off we go again. And we need to be thinking about ways of intervening at that stage so you don't have the revolving door and the serial offenses that DV often is.
Which will leave.
I didn't know it was a 2-hour event.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about eliminating the cash bail system like they recently did in New Jersey.
Let me say, the federal government did that back in 1984. It adopted a system whereby you can have a pre-trial detention hearing, and the government can be required to prove that release would endanger the community. So you can constitutionally have an alternative to the cash bail system, because that case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court and they upheld the federal statute. The result is, if a state wanted to guarantee that its revision of the cash bail system would be upheld, just have a state version of what the federal government did. So it can be done. But not every state has done that, and I haven't done research into the ones that have or haven't and all that, but my colleague has.
It depends on why you're concerned about not having bail. If you're concerned about people not showing up, there's good research which shows we can pretty much improve the chances they will show up better than if they had bail.
How would you go about doing it? What does the research suggest?
Yeah, that's what the research says. You do a randomized experiment. Some people get required to pay bail. Some people are just given a phone call on their cell, and you see who does better. I mean, there's lots of experiments going on that are interesting. On the question of whether or not you're preventing future crime, okay, again, thank you very much. One of the things we're doing here in Philadelphia is we have a risk instrument based on machine learning, which magistrates would use, in which they would determine whether or not to release somebody independent of whether there's any requirement of bail, based on the risk they pose. So we did some simulations on domestic violence, and that if they used our instrument instead of the current magistrate's judgment, you'd reduce reported DV cases in Philadelphia by several thousand a year.
Anybody else have any questions?
Does reduction of reported DV cases equate to reduction of DV?
Sure. The honest answer is we don't know. But we do know that from the criminal justice's side of things, and this is going to sound a little horrible, but they don't care about crime. It's not reported. Right. Police don't get involved, and so it's not an issue for them. But we don't know. One of the things we'd be concerned about, of course, is that if a person is released and goes back and threatens the victim, you call the cops ever again and you're really in trouble, then of course subsequent events are not reported. We don't know how to handle that. I'm going to go back.
I'll come up there. Just following this thread, have you done studies, have you looked at research on DV crimes that you've had a cash bail system, or you've had not incarceration that later results in a homicide for that DV victim?
Well, the more general issue about homicides associated with DV, we worked on that question. We tried to with Philadelphia Police Department. Thankfully, such homicides are very rare. I mean, they get all the publicity, but there are perhaps as many as a half dozen per year in Philadelphia that are DV-related homicides. So we don't have tools which really can do forecasting when we have such few cases. So the answer is we don't know. But I'll mention something that was off my computer yesterday. It turns out that you can simulate, I'll talk about it later in the details if you want with you, but you can simulate what an offender would have to look like to do that. And you can simulate pretty accurately so that you can tell police officers, here's a checklist. If all these are checked positive, you've got a subsequent murderer on your hands, act accordingly. But it's not so much a forecast in the usual sense, it's a simulation. We can talk about it.
Do you have some idea, or can you give us some of the factors that might equate to it?
Sure. Did he break into, well, first of all, are they breaking up? We know that in DV cases, woman is most at risk when the relationship is ending. Did he break into the house to get to her? That's another example. Was there an order of protection? Was the order of protection violated? Was she injured in past DV incidents? How many incidents were there? Are there kids present? All those are risk factors.
Anybody else have any questions? All right, just one last issue that we were talking about before everybody arrived. In some of these reforms, there is an issue that raises its head and prevents some of them from being implemented, and that is race. And in some cases, when somebody makes a proposal to reform something or to make a change in how cases are processed or how cases are assessed or how prisoners to be released are assessed, sometimes politicians get involved and they talk about race and they're saying it's discriminatory. For an example, it was the cocaine and crack sentencing, and initially the African American community wanted more sentencing for cocaine, or was it crack use? I guess it was crack use. And then after that resulted in more African American males being put into jail, now they turn around and say, well, that's racist. So I know that I think Paul and Richard have looked at this issue, and I just wanted them to address it very quickly. And
Anytime you have racial disparities in the enforcement of the law, it's troublesome. But I think what you need to do is not just take that number as indicative of racism. You have to look at congeries of factors in addition, one of which, for example, is what is the community in which the crime is occurring look like? If you have a large black community and a large number of people are committing crimes in that community, leaving violent criminals, for example, in place because of the fear that if you arrested them or convicted them or imprisoned them, you would have a very large percentage of black offenders being arrested, convicted, and imprisoned, leaves the black residents of the community as future victims of those crimes. I mean, the way crime generally works is, given the way neighborhoods are set up, in a lot of street crimes, they're committed in the neighborhoods where people live or nearby. So if you have a predominantly black neighborhood and you have predominantly black muggers, the victims are also going to be predominantly black. You're not taking care of their interests and being free from the crimes that are being committed against them if you don't act to protect them for fear that too many blacks are now going to be arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. And if you look at the studies, you'll see that a large number of people in these communities themselves would like to see greater enforcement of the laws. In fact, Randall Kennedy, at least back in the 80s, said the real problem with racial justice in the United States wasn't that the police departments and the like were intentionally discriminating against offenders because they're black. The problem was they weren't aggressively enforcing the laws in black communities. So you have to take that factor into account too. This problem arose in drug trafficking basically because you had very severe laws under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, and the crack was being sold in open-air markets. It's a lot easier to make arrests
if people are selling drugs out in the open, where you can have people look at them from afar and take photographs of what they're doing, so that you have pictures of a particular John Doe selling crack cocaine in all the myriad ways it gets done, than if it's done inside. But if you don't enforce the laws in those communities, then all the harms from the sale of crack cocaine go unredressed, and the law-abiding black residents in those communities are the ones that suffer.
Right on. That's exactly right. I would just add one footnote to that, which is when you bring facts like this to the discussions, which can get very heated, there have been many in Philadelphia recently around risk assessment, but around bail reform. The risk that you face as a researcher is that those facts are ignored. For whatever reason, I'm not an expert, for whatever reason, a particular ideological position is taken and the facts don't matter. And you can give them lots and lots of different facts, facts still don't matter. I'll tell you one quick story. I was testifying before City Council about a risk tool. This was early on in the bail reform, and one of the council members turned to me and said, well, we want risk tools that are fair and accurate. And I said, well, it turns out those are incompatible, you can't do both. But I said, no, you can't have that. Here's what you can have. She said, no, I want risk tools that are fair and accurate. I said, no, you can't have them both. She said again, this, by the way, was on TV, which is, I think, part of the reason. No, I want risk tools that are fair and accurate. We went back and forth. I was giving her facts, just like you heard now from Paul. She did not change her position. So it's a really difficult problem because people have already dug in positions, and they're pretty impermeable to facts much of the time, as good as those facts may be.
Good news is you said they didn't pay attention to the facts. The bad news would be that they thought the facts were actually wrong.
Well, we never get that far because they just don't pay. A lot of folks just don't pay attention.
All right, I just want to say Paul has to leave because he has to catch a train. As I told you, I think we had two very dynamic speakers, two very interesting speakers, two very sophisticated speakers. So I just want to thank them for coming tonight. I want to thank you all for showing up because, or as if I say in Philadelphia, yous for showing up. This, as Paul said earlier, it's a Friday night. The fact that you're willing to be here to listen to this, we hope it was worth your while. And thanks again.